Welcome to my talk. Do you really need Hibernate? Does anybody of you know the Betteridge law? Yeah. Ian Betteridge was a UK journalist, and he said if a title has a question mark, then the answer is always no. So we can make that very short. If you like to go for lunch already, you know the answer. But before, I like to talk to you about track and field. I do sports, or I did track and field as well. And I'm in a sports club, and this here is the Tachi Kambunchi. She won the gold medal in Tokyo. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture is I built software for track and field competitions. So I do that as a hobby with my sports club, you know, but I was also involved in the application that we had for a big sports event last year with over 100,000 participants. But this is my pet project, and it's perfect for explaining concepts. I do that since 1997, I think, and had various versions. And today we will look into that, or I will show you something about that, how we can use something else than Hibernate. About me, I'm already 30 years in the industry. I'm a Java champion. I'm from Switzerland. And I'm also teaching, and if you are maybe once in Switzerland, come to our Java user group. We have one in every major city in Switzerland. Now, what I like to talk to you is about jOOQ, J-A-O-Q. And as you can see here, it says that you generate Java code from a database, and then you use that with the Fluent API to build SQL queries. That's it. And if you want to start with that, there's an example project, so you can take a picture of the QR code. There's a website for sure with documentation, and jOOQ also has a demo project. Does somebody remember the Sakila schema from MySQL back in the days? So that was a schema for video renting, something we don't do anymore since we have Netflix and stuff. But this is the demo, so there is a demo for all major databases included. Now, what's this jOOQ? jOOQ is database first. That means it assumes that the database in some form already exists, and it doesn't make any assumption about how this database should look like, so you're completely free, whatever you like to, and you can use it. So how does jOOQ work? jOOQ has two parts. So in the upper picture, you have this jOOQ domain-specific language. We will see that in a minute. It looks like SQL, but in Java. Are there any .NET developers, by the way? No, because .NET has something that's called LINQ, Language Integrated Query, and that's better. But we can't do that with Java because Java doesn't have the feature that .NET has to do that, right? So this will be a Java DSL. And then on the lower part of the slide, we have the jOOQ generator that is generating classes from the database. So this is comparable. Who is using Hibernate or JPA? So you may know about the MetaModel API, where it generates classes from your annotations on the classes. That's similar, but the source here is the database and not some annotations. Now the question is, should you use JPA or jOOQ? The point is, that's not really the question. It's more about which approach do you follow, or what type of application are you building. Because the difference between these two is, if we talk about JPA and Hibernate, it's something called entity state transition. So you mean you read something from the database, an object, and then you change the state of this object or object graph or tree, and finally it will be stored. You don't do anything, right? So it's bound to the transaction, it will be stored to the database. On the other hand, we have jOOQ, and jOOQ is something called data set transformation. So you read records, change records, and send it back to the database. Not Java records, by the way, but database records, right? And the question is, which one is the better fit? Here I wrote, it doesn't really matter. It depends on you, on your use case, on the needs. But as we have AI now, I have a clear opinion on which one is better. Because in my opinion, if we don't write the code ourselves, we don't need an abstraction, right? Because AI is very good at writing SQL, and AI can transform the result set directly into classes. So you don't really need Hibernate anymore, in my opinion, but this really depends on how you're working, what your preferences, so I wouldn't recommend any of these two. In my opinion, or in my case, I don't use JPA anymore for some reasons. The funny thing is I'm a university teacher and I'm teaching JPA and Hibernate since 2008 or something. So I know it very well, and that's the reason why I don't use it. Now the point is, Hibernate is a very, very complicated framework. That's because of the problem is very complicated. So you have this mismatch between objects, classes, and database tables, and that's not so easy to solve. And Hibernate used to add more and more and more features, and it became more complicated, and there are a lot of things that could fail. So you may know about the n+1 select problem, where you get thousands of database statements, maybe if you don't have set the lazy loading correctly. So that's something that I see in practice, so it's probably easier to just start with SQL. Now, in one talk that I gave at the conference, someone asked, hey, does jOOQ scale? And I was thinking about this question because that was kind of weird, because the question is, does Hibernate scale? And I'm working in software modernization projects for the last 10 years. And what I often see is a monolithic system with a lot of entities. So for example, currently I'm working for a wholesale company in Switzerland. We are modernizing the ERP system. And there we have around 1,000 entities. And these entities are all mapped together, right? And you wouldn't want to see that code. But on the other hand, SQL scales anyway because you don't map anything, right? So you have foreign keys, but they are loosely coupled. So you can join whatever you like to. It doesn't really matter. And jOOQ was, by the way, created also from a Swiss guy. It's Lukas Eder, and he created jOOQ because he was working at a Swiss bank, and they had thousands of database tables and even more stored procedures. And he needed to find a way how to access the database in an efficient way. And that's why he created jOOQ. There's also something else called query-DSL. Maybe you heard about that. That is similar, but the difference is query-DSL is no longer really supported. And jOOQ has a dual licensing model. That means if you use an open source database like MariaDB or Postgres, then it's completely free. If you use Oracle or Microsoft SQL database or something else, then there's a fee to pay. And that's how it's also sustainable, because with that, the team gets money to work on that. And Lukas Eder, by the way, is probably the single person in the world who filed an issue in all relational databases that are available, because he had to integrate all databases and he found bugs in the databases during his work. To me, the biggest project I worked with jOOQ was also an ERP product. They had around 2,000 tables and views and 5,000 stored procedures and functions. Does anybody use stored procedures still? Is it fun to use that with JDBC? It's fun with jOOQ, because if you have a stored procedure, I don't have any, so I can't show you, but it generates just a class. That means each procedure or package or function will be a class. You instantiate that and you call execute, and then you're done. So that's the best way, in my opinion, to work with that, because you will not notice that you really use stored procedures. You have the impression that you just use regular Java code. Now, my project, before we go into, is that one. So that means the major functionality here is to manage data. So we have like, for example, let's take that one. We have the children that are there, and you can edit that. So that's a traditional kind of CRUD application, right? And most of the business applications that I do, so I work for wholesale, retail, railways, what else, insurance companies, stuff like that. And they all have these kind of business applications, right? Data heavy with a lot of UI. Maybe this will change in the future, because a lot of people predict that the future of UI will be a chat and no longer these UIs that we have. But in the meanwhile, we still have this editor-like and grid-like styles. And in particular for these kinds of applications, in my opinion, you don't need Hibernate. Because what we see here are single records, right? So this here below, the category, for example, that's just a projection of a table called category. If we want to edit that, we also edit just that. We get another grid below, but we don't want to load that in one go because the grid will load itself. So we rarely have nested structure that we want to send to a client. Sometimes if you do public APIs, then nested structure are relevant, right? Because you may want to send the category with these are the events and the formulas to calculate the points in one go. But if you have a UI, the UI is usually asynchronous. So it loads first header data and then it reloads the table because the table may be lazy loaded and stuff like that. So you don't need the nested structure. But there is one use case where I need nested structure. That's for the ranking lists. So if I do a ranking, then I will get that one. So we have the competition with categories and the kids with here the line below. That's the event like 80 meters, for example, or long jump and shot put. And you have the results with the calculated points. And that's a tree. So we have competition, we have category, we have athlete, we have event, and we have result. So we have 5 levels in that tree. And just keep that in mind. We will go back to that later on. So the data structure that I will do in the demo looks like that. The organization on top, it's just because this application is multi-tenant capable. So you can, does somebody do track and field or is in the track and field club, by the way? If you know someone, you can tell them about this project because they can use that for free. It's open source and it runs in the cloud, and maybe someone can use that. And then below that we have series because we have some competitions that run in multiple, or we have multiple competitions that will be together form a series that will then get the final result list. For example, we have clubs with athletes, category results, and events. So that's how the database structure looks like. And here we have the project. So it's a regular Maven project that I use. I forget something, then gets back to that, because the question here is, what's the database? Or how do we generate that? And in fact, you have multiple options. First of all, you could go ahead and say, okay, that's my reference database. It's running somewhere, and I use that. So I need JDBC URL, configure a Maven plugin or a Gradle plugin, and then it generates the code. So more or less, it's not like Hibernate, but it generates that with a plugin. The other way you could do is you could use Flyway or Liquibase. Who is using migration tools like Flyway or Liquibase? You can use that as the input, and then it will generate the code from the DDL statements. That's not the best way to do that, because if you create objects in a database with DDL, the database could decide to add additional objects. So for example, if you have a primary key, then the database may automatically generate an index. And you may need this information, or you may want to have this information. And so that's the least good way to generate that. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is use test containers. Who uses test containers? So what you could do is you could spin up a test container with the database, then apply the migration scripts, and then generate the code from that. That works very well until your database is big. So the example before, like 2,000 views and tables and 5,000 stored procedures, produces around 11,000 database classes, Java classes. And the generation is very fast. That's not a problem. But have you ever compiled 11,000 Java classes? This takes 5 minutes. So it depends a bit on your build server. Maybe we could have a faster one. but very often it takes a few minutes. So that's not something that you want to do always when the database changes or when you build the project. And that's also the questions, do you put these generated classes under version control or not? I usually don't. With smaller projects, with bigger projects, I do. So, or the other way around, we have a separate project that generates the metadata classes, and this will be then a library that we publish in the main repository and can use from there. So that's something very important. In this project here, I was lazy because that uses H2 database and it has the plugin configured. So here we have this jOOQ codegen plugin, and this is bound to the generate sources phase, and then we'll use in that case the DDL database because I have flyway scripts attached. That's just for demo, so that's not what I would do in production, right? That's just for a demo. And here we can configure multiple things. So here it's not much configured, just where it should be output, and then we will have it in the target generated sources folder. It creates the data. We could also do that in source main, then we could add it to version control, and we can add a lot of extra stuff there. So we could add data access objects that could be generated, we could generate poacher, we could generate a lot of things, and you can also add filters. So you want to exclude something or include something, or depending on which schema do you use, there is a lot of things that you can configure here. So maybe we look at the schema first. So this is a flyway migration script, and it creates a table. So we have tables, they have a sequence, so that's automatically generated. I could also use serial, by the way, that would result in the same if I had a Postgres database. That's just as well for demo purposes. And here we have the tables. And what jOOQ will generate is, first of all, it will generate a class per table. So it will generate some metadata. I forgot about that. So we have here all the tables that are available. We also have the sequences and stuff like that. And then we have classes per tables. And this is the meta model that you will use, like the metadata API model that is generated with Hibernate to write type-safe queries. That's the point here. But jOOQ also generates something else, and these are the records. And records are kind of an implementation of an active record pattern. Has anybody heard about the active record pattern? It's a very old one. If you go to Martin Fowler's webpage, it's described there. Does anybody know Ruby on Rails? They use this active record pattern. And the active record pattern means you have a record, like here the athlete, and this has getters and setters for all fields. And it also has methods like, for example, store. And store will then execute either an insert or an update depending on the state of the record, right? And you can use that directly, but this is just a representation of the full database table with all columns. And you rarely need that, right? Maybe to create data, then it could be helpful, but other than that, you usually do projection and you don't need all columns anyway. Important to say here is, in contrast to Hibernate, we don't have any relationships. So if you look here, the athlete is kind of bound to a category. So let's go to the table. There we should find somewhere a club ID because it has a club. It belongs to an organization, and no, the category is a n plus n relationship, so we don't have that. But it adds just the foreign keys. So you have to deal with the foreign keys your own. So it's not like Hibernate where you add one-to-one or many-to-one or something else of these relationships and it get automatically stored. You have to manage that. But again, this doesn't really matter because if we look at my application here, if we have, for example, the athlete here, if we go here, sorry, and if we edit that, we have this relationship to the club, right? But that's a select box, and this will set the foreign key. So you will not set the club. So this most often doesn't make sense because sometimes you don't even need to load that data, right? Just to display. Cool. That's more or less how it works. And the important thing about this metadata that is generated, that's very helpful, because you can use that, for example, to create dynamic UIs, because you have everything you need to know. For example, you know the name, the type for sure, but you also know if it's nullable or not. You know the default value, for example, and you also know if it's a primary key or a foreign key or something like that. So you can introspect the database schema through these classes, and you don't need to go to the database. Because if you want to do that with the database directly, you have to have this result set metadata, and this is very difficult to introspect. And here you have something that works very well. And one of the systems that I modernized, we have a lot of dynamic stuff. So the UI is defined in the database. It's a product, and the customers can change the product to their needs. And so we have a lot of dynamic things. So that's what's generating. It generates a lot. And if we would have stored procedure, it would create the class, right? Now, I added some tests here. One is a query test, and here we have some methods just to walk through how things work. First of all, this is a Spring Boot project, and Spring Boot has these test slices. And jOOQ has also a test slice. It's called jOOQ test. And in that case, it only constructs the DSL context. So there are no services, no repository, nothing, just that. And you can use that to test queries, more or less. The starting point for jOOQ is the DSL context. That's comparable to the entity manager in JPA or the session in Hibernate. That's just kind of a data access pattern that you can use. And if you want to select something, for example, then you can use this DSL. And there's a shortcut for select from. You just say select from, then you pass the constant that was generated for the competition, and then you can fetch it and you get back a result. The result is nothing else than a list, because results from the database are always ordered. Either you say order by, or the database will decide in which order you get it. And here in that case, because we select all the columns from this table, we get this competition record back. And we could edit that. So we could, if we get that, we could iterate over the results and then set something and call store, and this will be saved. If you want to do insert statements, jOOQ can do that as well for sure. So we have here an insert statement. We insert Mujinga Kambunchi. That's the sister of the girl who won the hurdles. She's also a sprinter. And here we see that we can use all the columns. And the good thing about that, it's like the Hibernate or the JPA meta model. If the database changes, for example, last name is no longer last name, it's get changed to something else, then your code will not compile. And because the code will not compile if the database changes, it's a very good fit for AI in contrast to directly doing SQL in strings. Or, I mean, you could do Spring Data JDBC and use text blocks. That's nice, and IntelliJ has core completion, but that's not compile time safe. You will see it on runtime if it works or not. And here you have shift left, right? You are very early in the process, and this will not compile if something changes. Not only if it's not changing, but also if I, for example, here set an integer instead of a string, the code does not compile because it doesn't match the columns. And that's something very helpful because this will prevent you from a lot of bugs. And because you have the DSL, you could even argue we don't need tests for that because the SQL statement is syntactically correct and all the things that we use are correct and existing in the database, so we don't need a test at all. Then we could also use directly the athlete. Here you see that the DSL has a method, new record, and this construct a new of this active records here, the athlete record. And the reason for that is like with Hibernate or with JPA, where you have to call persist or merge, you have to put that into the kind of the session. So jOOQ has no session, it has just a connection to the database, but you have to do that, and then finally you can store it here. So that's quite useful. So if you build a simple CRUD application, just use these records and you're done. So you don't have to do a lot. But most of the time you don't want to just select all the rows from a table, you want to do a projection. And here we see that we can select the first name, last name, and the name of the club, for example. Then we join, and that's also something that we have to do here at the moment, because we don't know better, but we have to join the other table. Then we can have a condition, for example. And the result here that is returned from this fetch will be again a result, but this time it will be a record 3. So there is record 1 to record 22. The reason for 22 is jOOQ is not only available for Java, it's also available for Kotlin or for Scala. And tuples in Scala in older versions were up to 22. So you couldn't create a tuple with more than 22 components. And that's why jOOQ has this record 1 to 22. But as you can see here, that's also typed. So if the type doesn't match result, then you get a compile time error. And here we also see how we can access then the data. So we get athletes back here, and then I iterate over that and do some assertions. And here you see there's a get method where I can pass the name of the column. And this is also type safe depending on the type of the column. And then I get the data back. But that's not nice, right? So I don't want to deal with record 1, record 17, whatever this could be. So it's much better to create a DTO. And I have a DTO here, so that's exactly the same. For reading, records are perfect. So you should always use records and not something else, because you don't want to change the data. You can't change the data that way. And that's why, in my opinion, Java records are perfect for that. That's also something that jOOQ would do differently, maybe because they have a class called record. So record is a database record in terms of jOOQ, but now we have a name class, because in the JavaLang package we have a record class, and you have to make sure that we import the right record. That's something that we could use, because then we have it way simpler. We can just use the getters from the record. But now we still have this join, right? And in Hibernate you don't have to write join. Only if you have too many relationships, then you have to join that. But also with jOOQ you don't have, because jOOQ analyzes the database. jOOQ knows all about the foreign keys you have in your database tables, and it can generate something for you, and then you can simply omit that. So if you have a relationship, for example, from athlete to club, you can use that like the dot operators, so to say, in JPQL to navigate to the club, and then use a column from there. That's something that you could use. And let's go to the last one first. Then we have also delete, so we can delete data directly, as you can see here, and we can do a lot of other things. I forgot something before about that. The insert statement also can return something. Did you know that insert statements in the database can return data? And with jOOQ you can use that, because the primary key here in that case is auto-generated in the database, and you directly get the generated fields back. And that's very helpful because we do a lot of things in the database. So with Hibernate or JPA, you very often use entity listeners, right? With pre-persist, pre-update, stuff like that, to kind of auditing like a created table or created at column or created user column or something like that. With jOOQ we don't do that, we use triggers. And if you use triggers, we have to get the data back. And the cool thing about this one with this updatable record that we have here, it will also return everything that is generated in the database, because jOOQ, based on the metadata, knows which columns are computed in the database, and then it will return the data from the database. And that means that the atlet record, if it had kind of an updated at column, this will be also directly into the record after the store call here. Now that's fine, right? That's simple, but we have still a problem. We want to load nested data. And with Hibernate, in fact, you can load nested data, right? You have these relationships, but you can only load entities. So there's no way to return a nested projection with Hibernate. So that means you always need to work on the entities, even if you only need a small amount of the data that is there inside in the database. And the jOOQ has, I call that superpower, because to create that ranking list, I just need one SQL statement. But before we have a look at the simpler one, so here in that case, I created another DTO, that's the athlete with club DTO, that has the first name, the last name, but this time I don't want to return the club name alone, because the club also has an abbreviation and I want to have that in the result as well. So I created that. And now I can go ahead and return that. And there are so-called row value constructors. This is not something that jOOQ invented, because the database can do that. So you can load nested data from the database, not multiple rows, but a single row. So in that case, we can execute that query, then you can see it. By the way, if you work with jOOQ, you should turn on the logging in development, and that's just a logger org jOOQ, and set it to debug. And if you do that, you get a lot of cool stuff that you don't get with Hibernate, because jOOQ will, first of all, send you a tip of the day. And you should read that every time you run your tests, because what can we do? We could improve something, and then we get a link to the documentation, and we can learn something. But what jOOQ also does, it logs the SQL statements. And what's better than with Hibernate is it logs it twice. So that doesn't mean that it executes it twice, but jOOQ always uses prepared statements. And that's a good thing, right? Because prepared statements prevent from SQL injection. You can't do SQL injection with prepared statements. And if you do nested or searching and you construct your statement with strings, for example, you run into problems sometimes, right? And here, but the problem with prepared statements is if you log that statement, you just see a question mark for each parameter. And that's what jOOQ does as well here. But the second one will be, jOOQ will inline the parameters in the query. So this will not be executed, right? That's just a log statement that is created here. That's very helpful, because you can take that and run it in your SQL developer or whatever tool you use. And the second thing jOOQ does, it creates a sample. So it doesn't log all the data. It loads up to 5 records usually, and displays the data. So that's very helpful if you're looking for problems. You may have seen that directly. Yep. And the problem is with Spring projection, you may run into the n+1 select problem. And if you use the projection, and so if you use interface projection, then it will load entities behind the scenes and fill the entities into the data. So it will not directly execute a single SQL statement. That's the difference here.
Yeah, you would have to add additional annotations
yeah.
into the entity, like back references.
Exactly. And there's Spring Data JDBC that also is able to load nested data, but just in one level. On one level, that's it, right? And here you see that's the nested structure, right? So if maybe we could copy that, and then we can maybe have a look how this looks like so. put it away. And here you see that we get this nested, and here it creates kind of a derived table that it uses then in the projection to get data from. Right? But we can do that much more complicated, because what we really want to do is this ranking list. And here I have data, and this data looks like this. It's a bit long, but we have on the top level the competition with the name, the date, and so on. And then we have a nested list of categories. The categories has a list of athletes, and the athlete has a list of results. And to create the query that loads that data, it's very simple. I just do that one. So it's not that simple because it's nested, you know. And it took me a while to do that. Now I can just ask AI now in the meanwhile. But when I did that a few years ago, it took me a while to wrap around my head around the ID. But the superpower here is this multiset. So multiset does not exist in the database. You cannot do that. The SQL expert group is discussing that already for a long time, how you could get nested data back. But there's a trick. You could do that, I would say, since the 90s, because in the 90s, databases introduced XML in the database. So you could use XML functionality to return nested structure. Nowadays, we have JSON functionality in the database, and you can return JSON data. And that was what jOOQ is doing. So it creates, we can see that in a minute. It creates a JSON query, and then it more or less deserializes the JSON data into your objects. That's how it's done. If you think about that, if you have a REST API and need JSON data, you could do that directly with the database. You don't need even something in between. But I would also, in that case, use jOOQ because it adds this type safety, which you would lose when you directly use JSON. One warning, and this doesn't work with all databases here. I was invited to do a podcast, or not a podcast, a video cast with MySQL, or it's SQL. It's the name of their cloud database, and I used that example. And I didn't test it, because I usually use Postgres or Oracle databases, and both are very capable databases, in my opinion. And I had to use that that was not MySQL, that was MariaDB. I think MySQL can do that in the meanwhile, because MySQL is maintained by Oracle, and they added a lot of functionality from the Oracle database to the MySQL database, but MariaDB is still an older version, so to say, of MySQL.
Yeah, they don't support JSON columns.
Yeah, and they don't support nested derived tables after some levels. And it failed during the demo live at that webinar. That was a bit annoying. But what happens here, with this multi-select set, I can add nested select statements, as you can see here, to select the category, to select the athlete. Here again, I use this implicit join. I don't have to write that. And here, then the results. And here you can see what happens when the database table and the column has the same name. Because jOOQ needs to distinguish between the two types, and that's why this result column here has an underscore at the end. So that's just something jOOQ adds. If I would go back, I would probably either rename the database table or the column. And there is something that, I don't know if Hibernate should, I'm not sure. What I can do with that, I can order all the sub-results. And Hibernate, in my opinion, is not able. You have a Hibernate annotation, it's called order by, but this is statically on the entity. You can only sort by that. Here I can dynamically sort by whatever I like to, so that's something. And here after that you see how I now have to map the data into my classes. So the multiset value constructor has a convert from method, and here I get the record. And because the result directly maps to my constructor, because it's a Java record, I can directly pass here the static initializer of the record, right? Or the static reference to the constructor, so to say. And that I have to do on all levels. And finally, on the lower level, I can just say mapping. So that's a static method from the records class, and then map it to data. And jOOQ will return that. Thank you. Cool. That's it. So let's run it. I have a test here. And if I run that.
No question. Are there any using, but were there when I compiled? Is that going to break things?
Yeah, absolutely. So that means you have to have your metadata generation in the build process. So that means if you do it like that, then you have that, because I changed the flyway script and it will compile, it will regenerate the metadata from this flyway script. With the customer where we have the huge database, we have the process, so that the process with the database changes are also in the version control. So this will kick on a CI/CD pipeline that will generate that, and then we have a new library. We will get informed about that, or we will directly incorporate it with Renovate bot directly in the project. But there's certainly, if you do that, certainly kind of a time slot where it can break. So you change the database and you have that.
If I change the database in ways that I'm not actually calling the fields for my code, will it still work?
Yeah, absolutely. So jOOQ doesn't check that. Because with Hibernate you can say validate. So there's a DDL generation type validate, and this will validate if your mapping matches the database. jOOQ doesn't check that. It just generates the data from one database, and then during runtime you can change the database. And if you don't have any queries that touch the tables or columns that have changed, then you absolutely have no problem here. Cool. So now let's have a look at the generated SQL statement, because that's a funny one. Here we are. So what jOOQ here is doing, as I said, it uses JSON functionality. And this works with H2, luckily. By the way, I would never use H2 anymore, because with test containers you can run the real database in a container even if you use Oracle databases, because most of my customers use these Oracle databases, and they are heavy. But Gerald Wenzel here from the database team created a Docker container for the Oracle database that starts in about 20 seconds or 15 seconds. And that's okay-ish, so to say. And here you see that it uses a JSON array functionality or JSON aggregate functionality to put that thing together, right?
Does it make it very slow?
That's a very, very good question. That really depends. So I mean, we're here with Oracle, you can ask the database guys and they say, no, it will not be slower because it's very, very, very fast. I did some measurements with Postgres, and depending on the nesting and the size of the data set, it will be slower than probably a product would be faster. Because Hibernate, if you use entity graphs or join fetch, it will just do a Cartesian product, and then it will deduplicate the data inside. And here you don't have the deduplication, but the execution may be slower. But the JSON functionality in the databases, especially Postgres and Oracle, are very, very fast.
Yeah, but I can assume that, or I think that's maybe JSON.
Yeah.
Then you will not get that benefit.
Absolutely. In the meanwhile, you can add JSON indexes in most of the databases, so you can do a lot. We have just a hint. Who is using Oracle databases? If you use Oracle 23 or later, there is something called the JSON relational duality view. Just as a hint. Google that and check it out. This will also maybe help you. So now, as I said, I would always use jOOQ, that's for sure. But we should also compare that, because in my opinion with jOOQ, querying is much better than with Hibernate. Projection is much better. You have this nested structure. If you have to use functional stored procedures or packages, use that because it's very simple to use. And if you need to do bulk updates or batch processing, I will never ever use Hibernate anymore. I did that when I was young, but I wouldn't do that anymore. But on the other hand, we have JPA or Hibernate. That's very cool if you're in kind of a domain-driven design setup and you really have this rich domain model where you have an order and you can place that and a lot of things happen. And then finally storing the thing on the database is just the last step. And then you have a benefit from that. But if you're doing CRUD, I would say you have no benefit from JPA, it's just overhead. And cascading insert, update, delete, and orphan removal are very nice because you don't have to execute multiple delete statements. But in a database, you could have cascading deletes, for example, then this is solved as well. So that's it. We have 4 minutes for questions. The question was, would it make more sense to generate directly class files instead of source files? No. Yes and no. I mean, you need to... I mean, it's simpler to generate source files and compile that instead of directly generate class files. But by the end, if you do that in a separate process, like we did in the large database, then you just have the class files. We don't generate the source files. But you may want to have the source files anyway because you want to look at it. And something I didn't show you because I don't have, but you can comment the database tables, the columns, every object in the database can have comments. And jOOQ takes the comments and puts it in the Java classes. So you can use that directly so you don't have to look at the database at all. So that's probably better to use the Java classes. Yep. Yep. The question is if you have parent-child relationship, you mean also maybe inheritance, for example. Does it make sense to use jOOQ or not? I mean, inheritance is exactly that thing that you don't have in a database, right? So you have these different strategies, how you can map object inheritance into database tables, and none of these are good, in my opinion. So they all have trade-offs. But the point is, do you really need inheritance? So do you really need inheritance? Because usually inheritance is just... Inheritance was made to inherit functionality or methods and not only state. So that's maybe the reason. But you can do that. So you can map anything with it. Yeah. Yeah, the question is, if you want to do bulk inserts, for example, is it also a good solution? The answer is yes, because you want to do batching with that. And with jOOQ, you can say, okay, these are my insert statements, execute that in a batch. And you can define the batch size like you can do with Hibernate as well. And then it will not, because sending a lot of insert statements to the database takes a long time because of the overhead. So you want to send that in batches.
So like, that's compatible with...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everything that you can do with SQL, you can do with jOOQ. Yeah.
Is that the same store command?
No, if you want to do that, you will execute insert statements. Then you can always bulk or batch inserts as well with the store command, so that also works. By the way, jOOQ has something that we don't have in Java. jOOQ can do nested transactions, real nested transaction, not only nested transactions like this one is stopped and then the other continues, but really nested with checkpoints and save points and everything. So that is not possible from Java with the JTA or with the Spring transaction currently.
It's also not advised by our DBAs.
It depends what you want to do. Okay, session is over. Thanks a lot for coming.